Perhaps the most frightening crimes are those involving completely unmotivated and inexplicable brutality, especially when children are affected. Judging by these parameters, today's story is one of the most heinous and cruel cases in global criminal history. Luisa Camore was born near Western Area, South Africa. Fate had always intertwined her life with violent people. In 1984, when she was 10 years old, her father died. The child had a close relationship with him. Despite working a lot, he always had time for his daughter. Soon after her father's death, Luisa's mother found a new man, but the stepfather turned out to be a bad person. He constantly humiliated the entire family, both morally and physically. His years of abuse were not in vain, as he made Luisa feel inferior. He did everything he could to make those around him feel worthless. As she grew up, Luisa could no longer endure this treatment and sought a way to distance herself from her family. So she hastily married the first man she met. His name was Freddie. He was 4 years older than her, and, to her dismay, no better than her stepfather. Her husband plunged her into an atmosphere of terror and constant fear. Fortunately, the young woman was lucky, and with the support of her mother, Luisa was able to free herself from the oppression of this relationship. After separating from Freddie, Luisa met a mechanic named Christo van der Merwe. He was quiet, hardworking, and caring, and seemed to suit her much better. They began dating and soon married. The newlyweds continued to live in the same area of South Africa. The couple first had a little boy they named Johan. 2 years later, on August 9, 2013, Poppy van der Merwe was born. The girl was astonishingly beautiful, with blonde hair and large blue eyes. Everyone who knew her emphasized the child's beauty, called her a doll, and admired Poppy. Unfortunately for Luisa, her new marriage was also doomed to fail. After the children were born, her husband changed dramatically before her eyes and became violent. Soon, abuse began. The young mother realized that this had to end, as it wouldn't get better. In 2014, just a year after her daughter's birth, she filed for divorce. According to the woman's confession, Christo beat her, just like her previous partner, and shortly before the divorce, he threatened to kill her. He began to behave so inappropriately that the mother of two was forced to obtain a restraining order against him. After the divorce, he had the right to 3 visits a month, during which he could interact with the children, but only under the supervision of a social worker. Additionally, he was allowed to call his children once a week. Most of these conversations were subsequently recorded. Christo adhered to all regulations and seemed to be a responsible person. Luisa, however, claimed he was a real monster. Soon, the young mother decided to move with her 2 children, and she found herself 500 kilometers away in the small settlement of Orania. In fact, it was a very small settlement with just over 1,000 inhabitants. The population consisted exclusively of white people, and the settlement was one of the safest in the region. The descendants of Dutch, German, and French settlers lived there. The protagonist of our story believed she could finally build a peaceful life for herself and her children. The small family was welcomed by the Orania community. The locals and members of the Dutch Reformed Church took them in and helped the family settle. Thanks to their assistance, the young mother found an apartment and a job in a local supermarket. Additionally, community members helped finalize the divorce proceedings Luisa was undergoing. The woman also wanted to bring her daughter from a previous marriage, Marisha, away from her tyrannical father. The girl wanted to stay with her stepmother and, in return, take on much of the housework and help care for the younger children. With the help of community members, the young mother managed to take in the then 14-year-old student. She helped care for the children and also handled some of the daily household tasks to support Luisa. The teenager was given responsibility for cooking and cleaning. She integrated so seamlessly into this small family that the children sometimes called her mom. Marisha was naturally calmer than Luisa, which enabled her to manage the upbringing of small children better than a mother could. All this, of course, happened against the backdrop of Luisa's heavy workload, which consumed all her time and energy. In 2015, a man named Joseph Sonnier moved to Orania. He, too, was helped by community members and was offered a job at the local supermarket, where he met the mother of 2 children who had been living there for about a year. Like the heroine of our story, he had a series of failed marriages and relationships behind him. With each of his ex-wives, he had a child. In fact, he had been divorced twice. For his first child, he paid monthly child support. The man had little or no contact with his children and showed no interest in them. He had a very bad relationship with all his ex-wives. They called him a cruel man who knew no compassion. Unfortunately, Luisa didn't know this when she first met him. However, he seemed nice and friendly, as he had been more than once before, and so she let him into her life. She and Cobus entered into a romantic relationship quite quickly. A few months after they met, Luisa became engaged to him. Afterwards, the couple moved in together, and on November 14th of that year, 2015, they married. The day after the wedding, Cobus suddenly threw Marisha out of the house and sent her by bus to her father's home, so her favorite nanny and sister could no longer care for the children. This change in family life was very traumatic for the children. Johan and Poppy were very attached to Marisha, who was now replaced by a new man who paid them little attention. Because of this sudden change, the children became very moody. They found it hard to cope with the separation from their sister. To the great disappointment of the children, Cobus soon turned out to be the exact opposite of what they had expected. Marisha's care gave the children a sense of being needed and loved. She spent a lot of time with them and became a close person. The stepfather, on the other hand, was very irritable and constantly snapped at the children whenever they cried. During this time, both children were enrolled in a kindergarten as the adults were working and could no longer care for their daughter and son at home. The caregiver repeatedly saw the boy run away and hide in the bathroom when his mother and stepfather came to pick him up from kindergarten. The children did not want to go home. This was a clear sign. The kindergarten staff described Cobus as a very irritable and unpleasant man who seemed cold toward the children. On several occasions, the kindergarten staff noticed that the child behaved inappropriately when the parents brought him in. It was as if he was under the influence of medication. His reactions were slow. For this reason, it was suspected that the boy had been given sedatives. Johan was a very active boy. His parents had probably drugged him to manage and control him better. However, this was only a suspicion that could not be confirmed. When the caregivers asked the couple about this, they just laughed. No further such states were observed in the child later on. However, new symptoms of abuse appeared, which initially were not taken seriously. The caregivers noticed that the boy was often dressed in weather-inappropriate clothing, specifically the long-sleeve jackets and clothes in which the child was often brought to kindergarten, even in hot weather. Later, it was learned that this was done intentionally to hide the bruises on his body. When they tried to undress Johan, he became aggressive and prevented the caregivers from doing so he wore a jacket all day. According to the boy, his parents became very angry if he took off his thick clothing. Obviously, the parents intimidated the boy to prevent the revelation of domestic abuse to the care staff. After Luisa and Cobus began to question their behavior in the family, they simply stopped bringing Johan to kindergarten, while Poppy continued to attend regularly. According to law enforcement authorities, it was decided to stop bringing the younger girl to kindergarten because she was being asked questions and could not explain what was happening at home. Despite her obvious communication difficulties, the child tried to reveal the horrors of domestic violence. Little Poppy repeatedly told caregivers various horror stories and tried to show the bruises on her body, but the adults simply did not understand her. Over time, however, the caregivers noticed that the bruises on the child's body appeared in various strange places. They could appear on the earlobes or other atypical parts of the body. New bruises appeared faster than old injuries healed. Luisa and Cobus were repeatedly questioned about this. Each time, the couple invented new stories about the children's activities. According to the mother and stepfather, both Johann and Poppy were restless, ran and jumped a lot, so all the girls' injuries supposedly resulted from playing or carelessness. Since domestic violence could not be proven, the caregivers had to believe these stories. Moreover, the mother often claimed that the girl's older brother behaved aggressively toward her. Luisa pointed to Johann's behavior when she tried to explain why he no longer attended kindergarten. According to the mother, she was afraid that her son might traumatize one of the children, and therefore wanted to bring him back to kindergarten only when he was older and his stubbornness could be managed. The whole situation seemed strange to them, as the caregivers had never noticed that the boy behaved dangerously and aggressively in the presence of other children. On the contrary, he was intimidated and did not make contact. Despite the lengthy excuses, there were other people who suspected domestic violence in the family. A man who lived in the couple's neighborhood noticed that the adults were clearly violent toward the small children. He regularly heard arguments and saw the parents scolding and shouting at their daughter and son. Apparently, this behavior was triggered by the slightest misbehavior. The neighbor did not witness physical beatings firsthand, but he was sure they not only punished their children verbally, but also physically. One of the most unpleasant incidents, as the neighbor later recounted, involved Poppy. According to him, on one of the usual days, the stepfather began shouting loudly at the child, probably because the girl had wet the bed. Minutes after the scolding, the child began to scream loudly, and it was clear that she was not just crying out of resentment, but seemed to be beaten. The next day, the neighbor saw the little girl with a cast on her leg. The man also noticed the parents' indifference when they brought their daughter home from the hospital with a new cast. Her mother and stepfather didn't even help her out of the pickup truck. They drove their daughter around in the back seat of the truck like some kind of animal. The little girl not only struggled to get out of the truck, but also carried her backpack, which seemed quite heavy. Instead of supporting and helping her, her stepfather just hurried her along. The neighbor noticed that Poppy would wake up at night and cry. In his opinion, the child had nightmares, but instead of comforting her, the parents, whenever they reacted to her tears, would shout and swear at her, forcing her to be quiet. Nevertheless, she had such episodes almost every night, and the girl would cry quietly for about half an hour so that no one would hear her. But through the thin walls, the neighbor could hear the sobbing. Eventually, she would calm down on her own and fall back asleep. After the incident with the broken leg, and once the girl had recovered, there was another frightening case of aggression. A neighbor heard another argument begin in the family, followed by a dull thud. The girl again cried heavily and became hysterical. The neighbor saw her the next day as she walked around with a large hematoma on her head. Moreover, her right arm didn't seem to function properly. Poppy kept pressing it against her chest. At this point, the man couldn't take it anymore and went to her stepfather. He asked what was happening to the child, why the girl was constantly crying, and why she barely had time to heal her severe injuries. Cobus just grinned and became angry. He gave no answer and simply walked away. Instead, the children's mother spoke up. According to Luisa, the latest injuries were caused by a fall while playing on the stairs. She claimed the girl was very careless and constantly got into such incidents. It was just an accident, but the neighbor didn't believe her. What most outraged the neighbor was an incident in the winter when Cobus was working in the garden. It was quite cold, and the children were sitting on the porch. Suddenly, the man shouted at them and accused them of doing something wrong. The neighbor found this strange. He hadn't noticed the siblings doing anything bad. They were just sitting quietly. Then he undressed the children and doused them with cold water. The perverse man made them repeat some kind of apology that the neighbor couldn't understand. They did this while standing in the cold until they dried off, with the children crying and shivering violently. At the very least, they could have gotten sick. When the neighbor saw the abuse with his own eyes, he couldn't bear it anymore and went to social services. The staff of the organization should have investigated, written a report for the police, and then, of course, filed a request with law enforcement. However, there were no repercussions. The Social Protection Service simply ignored the incidents and the neighbor's statements. The man had to contact the organization several times until they finally took notice of the blatant brutality of the stepfather. The town was so small that it didn't even have a proper police station, court, or other important institutions. The nearest larger police station was at least 40 kilometers away, and the neighbor had no way to get there himself. But he didn't give up and kept contacting various organizations in his town to help the children. Fortunately, the cruelty did not go unnoticed, at least not by child protection officers. The children had a chance to end this nightmare. In August 2016, a meeting with Luisa and Cobus took place. The mother and stepfather were required to attend weekly checkups with a pediatrician, which both children had to attend. Additionally, the parents were obliged to attend special counseling sessions with a psychologist who dealt with family problems. The couple adhered to these rules for a while, but as it turned out, it was only for accountability. They went to counseling a few times in the first month and took the children to medical appointments only twice. It seemed they were on the path to improvement, but during this time, the neighbor reported the worst cases of domestic violence. When he again approached social services about this, he was once again brushed off with the excuse that they were already working with the family and had everything under control. But for some reason, that wasn't working, and the neighbor, for his part, could do nothing more. The man's words were quickly confirmed during the next medical examination. Multiple bruises were found on the body of 3-year-old Poppy. The girl was examined to determine their origin. Given her age, however, she was still very hard to understand. Her explanation only revealed that she was in great pain. In fact, the doctor conducting such examinations should have immediately documented any bruises. But in this case, the specialist did not follow procedures. The doctor later attributed the lack of documentation to the fact that the 3-year-old was unable to explain what had happened to her, and he assumed the bruises were ones she had gotten at home. The doctor simply attributed it to an accident while playing, which the mother, as usual, began to narrate, and no action was taken. One September morning in 2016, the neighbor woke up to find that Poppy's troubled family had moved out. They had done so under the cover of night, as if intentionally avoiding unnecessary witnesses, which aroused suspicion. Nevertheless, Cobus did not give up his job, and the staff at the kindergarten Poppy attended were not informed of the move. In fact, the couple wanted to evade responsibility and avoid a medical examination where they had nearly been caught. The parents decided to disappear and move to their new residence. Luisa and Cobus traveled to the farm Mamogaliescral, which was several hours away from the town. There, they lived with Luisa's family. It was a rare occasion for Luisa and her mother, along with their children, to be in one place. In fact, she rarely allowed the little ones to spend time with their grandmother. Luisa's mother, who herself had lived with an abuser for years, was shocked when she saw the children's condition. Luisa's mother immediately noticed the numerous bruises that covered almost the entire bodies of the children. When the grandmother tried to find out from the boy where all these injuries came from, he said Cobus had beaten him. Meanwhile, Luisa denied the domestic violence and labeled Johann a liar. After this visit, the woman became worried about what was happening in her daughter's family, but she was afraid of hurting her. Therefore, she decided to confide only in her pastor. To her great regret, The church pastor became angry instead of helping or at least supporting her. In the pastor's view, the grandmother should not interfere in her daughter's affairs since she was already married and should solve such problems herself. After that, Luisa's mother no longer contacted other services and did not try to help her grandchildren. On October 25, 2016, just 1 month after the family had refused medical examinations, Luisa ran into the local hospital with her daughter in her arms. She urgently demanded that medical staff help Poppy and perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation, stating that the girl had been unconscious for some time. All efforts were in vain. The staff immediately noticed the mother's suspicious behavior. It seemed as if she was completely indifferent to the child's fate. At the same time, she said she didn't want any trouble with the police. Even more suspicious were the child's injuries. Almost the entire body of the girl was one large bruise. When the mother was asked where all these bruises came from, she said her husband had rushed to the hospital because of the bad road, and the child had been severely shaken in the back seat of the car, causing bruises. This lie was quickly disproven. Bruises in various stages of healing were found on Poppy's body, indicating regular beatings of the girl. The bruises hadn't had time to disappear before new ones appeared. It was impossible to explain them by careless driving. The doctor noticed that the family had arrived with a second child. He immediately saw that 5-year-old Johan was cowering in a corner, trying to stay away from his parents and avoiding eye contact with adults. The child clenched his teeth and muttered something to himself. When asked what had happened, the boy replied, "Poppy doesn't want to eat anymore." Moreover, he had bruises on his body. All of this looked too suspicious and seemed to be connected to the incident in which a 3-year-old girl had died, so the doctor decided to call the police. Luisa and Cobus immediately tried to dissuade him, but the doctor ignored their words. When the first police officer arrived at the clinic, the doctor showed him a picture of Poppy's body. The police officer was a father himself. His child had just turned 1 year old. He was so stunned by the extent of the girl's mutilation that he wept. In his many years as a policeman, he had never seen such a mutilated body, not even that of an adult, let alone that of a little girl who had just learned to stand on her own feet. The stepfather was immediately taken to the police station, but Luisa was not detained because it was believed that she, like the children, had been a victim of domestic violence all these years. The true story of the 3-year-old's death will probably never be told. It was partially reconstructed based on witness statements, including a neighbor, a grandmother, the mother of the murdered girl, the murderer's statements, and physical evidence. But almost all the material contains inconsistencies and contradictions. While Cobus was taken to the station and interrogated, the officers decided to speak with Luisa. The woman said that the child had hit her head on a cupboard shortly before her death. This happened on the evening of October 24th. When the girl woke up the next day, she seemed to behave strangely. She appeared half asleep, inactive, barely spoke, and hardly moved. In the afternoon, Cobus returned from work. He was always in a bad mood, but that day Luisa asked him not to bully the children, who were unwell. But he didn't listen to her, and instead of greeting her, he kicked her in the stomach. According to the mother of the dead child, he did this almost every day. She didn't wait for the end of the beating and simply went shopping, and she recounted this quite calmly. When Luisa returned, Cobus said the girl was sick and had fainted. The mother found her daughter lying lifeless in the bathtub. She immediately noticed that the body was very cold and the lips were blue. They tried to resuscitate the girl, but it had no effect. They then decided to take her to the hospital and placed her on the back seat of a pickup truck. Then came one of the strangest parts of the story. Instead of carrying the 3-year-old girl in their arms, they threw her like an object into the empty cargo bed of the truck, where she slid around like a doll on the road's bumps. At the same time, this became a very convenient explanation for the numerous bruises that covered the deceased's body. When the grandmother saw the condition of her granddaughter, she simply couldn't believe that her own daughter could be involved. Like others, she didn't take seriously the idea that such injuries could occur from accidentally hitting a cupboard. According to investigators and the coroner, the child had been beaten for a long time, possibly even thrown against walls and furniture. According to the autopsy report, a large amount of blood had accumulated on the lower left side of the child's skull, characteristic of a severe head injury that could have been fatal. Abrasions were found all over the victim's body, particularly numerous on the face, chest, and thighs. It seemed as if the child had been kicked. This was confirmed by the victim's mother. Numerous other injuries were also found, indicating that the child had been the victim of a deliberate massacre. She had been systematically beaten over a long period. When the story reached the local community, attacks on Kobus began. During his detention, he was beaten multiple times and repeatedly threatened with death. However, Luisa, despite her complicity, did not seem to be targeted by the police. Gradually, the town's residents learned that she might have been involved in her daughter's death, just like the stepfather, and decided to take revenge on her. On the eve of the funeral, on November 4, 2016, Luisa was visited by two unknown women in police uniforms. They persuaded her to come with them to make a statement at the station. In reality, they took her out of town and severely beat her. It turned out that these women were not police officers, but locals who had decided to lynch her. In the end, Poppy's mother came to say goodbye to her child at the funeral in almost the same condition as the girl, but unlike her, still alive. Poppy's biological father, Christo van der Merwe, was seen crying during the farewell ceremony. He sat in the front row alongside friends and relatives. He blamed his ex-wife, who in his opinion had always been a bad mother, for everything. Luisa's face, which showed signs of a recent beating, displayed no remorse throughout the entire service, as if she were indifferent to her daughter's death. Luisa was arrested on December 15, 2016, facing the same charges as her husband. Despite the rapid progress of the case, the trial was postponed by a year. The hearings did not begin until October 2017. There were several reasons for this. The first was that there were no defense attorneys willing to represent the interests of the accused in court. The lawyers felt hostility toward the child murderers and refused to work with them. Furthermore, the constant attacks by fellow inmates forced Kobus to attempt suicide twice. Both times, the perpetrator's stomach was pumped, and he had to spend a long time recovering in the hospital. In any case, the postponement of the hearings was only to the prosecution's advantage. The additional time was enough to thoroughly question Johan, the brother of the dead girl. The boy claimed that his stepfather had beaten him and his sister daily, and the mother had simply watched quietly and even covered for her spouse, not trying to help them. According to the child, the beatings were so severe that the sounds of the blows were sometimes louder than their cries of pain. The boy's words were crucial in accusing his mother. Until the end, Luisa tried to justify herself. When she brought her daughter to the hospital, she claimed she had tried to revive her by splashing water on her face and performing resuscitation measures. Johan said that his sister was actually all wet, because after the beatings, her stepfather had dunked her head in the toilet and tried to bring her back to consciousness by flushing. During this procedure, according to Johan, the mother had simply stood in the doorway and watched without seriously trying to intervene. In the end, both were found guilty of the girl's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Additionally, each received another 10 years for endangering the life of their older child, who had miraculously survived the daily abuse. Even the judge was angry during the sentencing. He was not only outraged by the cruelty of these people, but also by their complete indifference to what had happened. All present agreed that the defendants were indifferent to the girl's death. They only cared about the punishment they would receive for it. During the trial, it became known that the neighbor had repeatedly appealed to social services to investigate the family for child abuse, but no one had responded to his appeals or rescued the children. Subsequently, the social workers, who should have contacted law enforcement, justified themselves by citing the distance and bureaucratic difficulties that prevented them from responding to the family's abuse. They were not held accountable for their negligence. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves. It's not easy to find one's true path, and some people only manage to do so in their later years. Unfortunately, by that time, a person may have already made many unpleasant acquaintances, and it can become dangerous. Today, we want to tell the story of vile hypocrisy and malice that led to a tragedy. Joseph Sonnier was born in 1955 into a well-respected family of physicians in Shreveport, Louisiana, USA, and from childhood, he wanted to follow in his family's footsteps. He graduated with honors in medical sciences from the University of Baton Rouge in 1976, and then completed his studies at Louisiana State University in Shreveport. While attending university, Joseph worked at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas, where he rose to become the chief resident in his final year of training. He became a pathologist and a partner in a laboratory, which he later sold. At the time of the events described, Dr. Sonnier was still employed as the lab's director and was also listed as the chief pathologist for the Covenant Health System in Lubbock, Texas. Dr. Joseph Sonnier was a respected and wealthy pathologist, making him quite a catch for any woman. He was a single man, famous, enjoying his freedom, his status, and his wealth. However, it wasn't always this way, as he had married his high school sweetheart Becky at the age of 19. The couple had 2 sons together. Sonnier was a fairly strict father, but it paid off. He believed in strict discipline for young boys, and his sons grew up to be responsible and decent men. Initially, the family was doing well, but after 27 years of marriage, Becky fell in love with another man. She honestly told her husband about this, and they eventually divorced. However, Becky's new relationship did not lead to a happy future, as her new lover turned out to be a dangerous man. Sometime after their marriage, he shot her, their dog, and then himself. Fortunately, the children, who were already adults and living separately, were not harmed in this tragedy. Dr. Sonnier was shocked by the brutal death of his ex-wife, but he had no idea that his own future would also be tainted with blood. As the years passed, Joseph continued to support his 2 sons. In 2007, he moved from Dallas to Lubbock to start a new life. Joseph planned to continue working while enjoying life, trying things he hadn't yet had the chance to appreciate, such as dancing. He started taking dance lessons, which brought him a lot of joy, especially as it allowed him to meet different women. He didn't give up hope of finding love. Over time, he attempted to form relationships with his dance partners, but nothing worked out. This went on for quite a while until, in July 2011, 57-year-old Joseph met the woman who, as it turned out, would become his destiny. Her name was Tina, a 47-year-old stunning and charming woman, almost 10 years younger than him. Before they met, Rachel had been a high-ranking executive in the NFL for a long time, building a successful career and wanting for nothing. She also had 4 children of her own, all of whom were grown. The couple had many things in common, and it's no wonder they hit it off quickly and fell deeply in love after some time. They spent more and more time together. Rachel's birthday was celebrated in Paris, and then Joseph took her to Los Angeles to introduce her to his family. The pathologist's wealth made it easy to take trips, regardless of their scale or cost. The relationship developed so quickly that the couple began to wish for marriage. At that time, Joseph had no idea that his new lover was a real ticking time bomb and that being with her would turn out to be dangerous. On July 11, 2012, the situation spiraled out of control. a landscaper who had come to the doctor's house to discuss an upcoming renovation, called 911. He reported that when he arrived at his client's house to inspect the patio, he couldn't reach the homeowner. However, he noticed the door was open. The landscaper assumed that Joseph simply hadn't heard him. The man entered the house and began calling out for him. The gardener saw chaos inside, and most suspiciously, he noticed a bullet hole in a window near the front door. It all looked like a break-in, and it was worrying. He cautiously continued inside, looking for the homeowner, but found no trace of him. The gardener then made his way to the garage, where he found Dr. Sonnier lying in a pool of blood with no signs of life. He had both gunshot and stab wounds on his body. The worker immediately exited the house and called 911. The call came in at 2:48 p.m., and the police quickly dispatched several patrols to the scene. When the officers arrived, they found the crime victim, quickly identified as 57-year-old Joseph Sonnier. Paramedics declared the renowned pathologist dead at the scene. This horrific crime took place in one of the calmest, safest, and most prestigious neighborhoods in the city. There was virtually no crime in this area, so the event shook the entire community. The wealthy pathologist had no enemies, and all of his friends and family described him as one of the calmest and kindest people they knew. He belonged to a prestigious profession and had no apparent enemies who would want to harm him. It was immediately clear that this was not a robbery, as nothing had been stolen from the house. However, a window had been broken, and a bottle with a shot-out bottom was found at the scene, which seemed to have been used as an improvised silencer for a gun. Investigators determined that the victim had been dead for some time when he was found. The blood had dried, the body was cold, and rigor mortis had set in. An estimated time of death was established, revealing that the man had died during the night. Crime scene investigators immediately arrived to determine the circumstances of the crime and gather evidence for the investigation. Ample evidence was available, as the attacker appeared to have left plenty behind, showing they were likely not a professional, but rather an amateur. DNA from the bottle, used as a silencer, was collected at the scene, as well as blood samples from 2 people. All of this evidence was sent to the lab for analysis. Neighboring residents reported seeing and hearing nothing suspicious, and there were no surveillance cameras nearby. Investigators deduced that the attacker had entered through the back door, using a large panoramic window that overlooked the backyard, a route favorable for a surprise attack. Inside the dining room, the attacker confronted his victim, which was when shots were fired. The wine bottle was probably used as a silencer at this point, though it didn't work. The doctor seemed to have been alive after that, as blood trails were found along the corridor leading to the garage, where the attacker began stabbing him, ultimately resulting in his death. An autopsy of the victim revealed 5 gunshot wounds and 11 stab wounds. Initially, detectives didn't believe this was a random crime, but they needed to figure out who had done it and why. Naturally, the first people they investigated were the pathologist's family and children, all of whom were in shock. Just 2 years earlier, their mother, Becky, had been shot by her new husband, and now their father had been killed in a similarly brutal manner. It seemed too coincidental for lightning to strike twice in the same family. Joseph's murder was the second devastating blow for the children, following the emotional torment of their biological mother's death. Within 2 years, they found themselves parentless. The brutal killing of Becky had deeply wounded Dr. Sonnier, a man who had spent nearly 3 decades of his life with her. He often reminisced about the years they spent together, mourning her loss. Despite his grief, he remained strong and became a pillar of support for his family, handling all the funeral arrangements and covering the expenses, while helping his sons cope with the trauma. Later, the children admitted that it was their father's support that helped each of them overcome the pain. The sons of the victim had no idea who would want to harm their father. He was a rock for many people, not just for the family, but also for his friends and colleagues. He was a charming, likable man with a fortune estimated at around $12 million, yet he never flaunted his wealth, preferring to stay humble. All of this made him one of the most desirable bachelors of his age in the city. Naturally, many women were attracted to him, and this became particularly noticeable when he started taking dance lessons. Since then, the charismatic millionaire had no shortage of attention from interested women. It was through dancing that he also met his new lover, Rachel, who was readily accepted by the entire family. Rachel was beautiful, cheerful, and fun. After meeting, the couple began to relax together at the best restaurants and private clubs in the city, as well as in more private settings. Joseph spared no effort when it came to his beloved, showering her with gifts. At this point, Rachel was 47 years old and completely enamored with her new partner. Numerous confirmations of her feelings were found, particularly in the many posts on her personal social media pages, where Rachel openly declared her love for the wealthy doctor. This was also confirmed by multiple witnesses, friends and acquaintances familiar with the couple, who had high hopes for their relationship. Joseph had been single for a long time and hadn't been able to start a new family, but it seemed that now a worthy woman had finally come into his life, and he was ready to marry her. The person closest to the victim was, without a doubt, his girlfriend Rachel, with whom he was inseparable. Naturally, the investigators spoke with her first. She described the deceased as the love of her life and said she could never have imagined something like this happening to him. She was deeply distraught by the events and didn't know what to do. During her conversation with the police, Rachel shared some strange details. She said that in the months leading up to the tragedy, odd things had been happening in the lives of the couple. Joseph seemed to be the victim of stalking, something he had confided to his fiancée about repeatedly. Rachel also mentioned that she herself had once seen a stranger who looked quite eerie standing outside their house on a rainy night, watching the door and windows as if observing them. However, she couldn't see his face clearly. Despite these unsettling events, Rachel said her fiancé tried to turn everything into a joke, seemingly underestimating the seriousness of the situation. Rachel also mentioned that Joseph had received multiple strange calls and threats in the months before his death, which were followed by a series of threatening text messages. After reflecting on the events, Rachel named several individuals she thought might be potential suspects. However, the police initially doubted her suggestions, suspecting that jealousy might have been one possible motive. Thanks to a few witnesses, the police learned that Joseph had been involved with multiple women at the time of his death. This prompted the investigators to ask Rachel if she knew whether her fiancé might have been involved in any extramarital relationships. She responded that she wasn't aware of any such affairs and denied that Joseph would have done anything like that, stating that it wasn't in his character. Joseph's sons also refuted the allegations, insisting that their father was a decent man who would never cheat. Faced with the obvious suspicions of the police, Rachel maintained her innocence. During her next interview, however, she broke down in tears and admitted that she knew several women who might have been involved in the murder. According to Rachel, there were several ex-girlfriends who had continuously harassed the doctor, with the pressure increasing in the months leading up to his death. Joseph had ignored them, but they had continued to bother him, unhappy that he was in a serious relationship with Rachel and preparing for marriage. One of these women was a dance instructor from Florida, who kept calling and texting him, even after Joseph had informed her of his serious relationship with Rachel. Rachel also suspected that a nurse, with whom the pathologist had worked some time ago, might be involved, as she too had been calling and texting him regularly. The third woman was someone with a daughter who had sent a threatening letter to Joseph shortly before the murder, accusing him of abandoning her and her child, which wasn't true. In addition to these women, Rachel was one of the first to point to Thomas Dixon, a plastic surgeon who worked at his private clinic. He specialized in cosmetic treatments and plastic surgery, and his clinic was located in another city. There was a possibility that Dixon had a motive to harm Joseph, as Rachel had been his former lover, and their breakup had been difficult. Thomas and Rachel had met in 2008 when she visited his clinic for Botox injections. Initially, their relationship was friendly, with light flirting, but it soon blossomed into an affair. The doctor began cheating on his wife with Rachel. After a few months, his wife found out and filed for divorce, but this didn't seem to bother the plastic surgeon. He was so deeply in love with Rachel that he divorced his wife, with whom he had been married for about 20 years. Thomas was determined to be with Rachel, and they continued their relationship only to break up again in 2010. Rachel described Thomas as a manipulative man who tried to control everything, including her freedom. He had stalked her for a long time, demanding that she return to him, which prompted Rachel to move away in order to escape him. After considering all the circumstances, Rachel came to believe that her ex, Thomas Dixon, had been the one stalking Joseph in the months leading up to his death. She revealed that the final stage of their relationship had been a nightmare, a roller coaster ride that had taken a serious toll on her. Rachel described her ex as a womanizer who couldn't resist any woman, and she said he tended toward emotional abuse, which led to their breakup. The main reason, she explained, was that Thomas was always lying, pretending to be something he wasn't. Once Rachel saw his true self, she was disappointed. Even after she moved to another city, Thomas tracked her down and continued to harass her. According to Rachel, he became emotionally desperate when he found out she was with another man. Realizing that he could no longer win her back, he even proposed the idea of them continuing their relationship despite her new relationship. He suggested a love triangle, which Rachel categorically refused. After that, she said she began to feel constantly stalked, and Joseph had also mentioned it to her. One time, she and her lover saw something that looked like a camera flash through a backyard window, but they only realized the seriousness of the problem later. Thomas Dixon quickly became a person of interest to the investigators, and they wanted to speak with him. The plastic surgeon lived 2 hours away from Lubbock, and the police officers went to question him, as he was now the main suspect in the case. Dixon willingly agreed to talk to the police. He admitted that he had indeed been madly in love with Rachel and had made many changes in his life for her, including divorcing his wife. He did everything he could to stay with Rachel, but unfortunately, they eventually broke up, which was a heavy blow for him. Dixon confessed that, for a time, he had been stalking her, but not to threaten her, he claimed. Rather, he wanted to win her back. Despite his efforts, Rachel continued to reject him, and Dixon eventually gave up and found another woman. At the time of the crime, Dixon was in a relationship with a medical student much younger than him. He insisted that he had moved on from Rachel, was no longer pursuing her, and certainly had nothing to do with her fiancé's murder. Dixon's new girlfriend served as his alibi. She confirmed that he had been at work and later with her when the crime took place. Additionally, solid evidence, including video footage, backed up his alibi, showing that everyone connected to the case had accounted for their whereabouts, including Rachel herself. Investigators then sought out people who might have had a grudge against Joseph, envied him, or wanted to take advantage of him. However, no new suspects surfaced. Meanwhile, the lab results came back, revealing that the DNA from the bottle did not belong to Joseph. One of the blood samples found at the scene matched Sonnier's, but the police database couldn't identify the other sample, meaning it would need to be compared with potential suspects to confirm guilt. The problem, however, was that there were no obvious suspects. A few days later, the police station received a call from an aspiring paramedic from Amarillo named Paul Reynolds. He claimed to live with a roommate who had recently confessed to the murder of Joseph Sonnier and had attempted suicide afterward, but was saved. Paul's roommate was named David Shepard. According to the witness, the murderer told him how he had broken into the house and shot the man, providing details that were only known to a small circle of investigators, such as the use of the wine bottle as a silencer. An outsider could not have known these details, making it clear that David was indeed informed about the crime. The police quickly turned their attention to the new suspect. They discovered that David Shepard had a violent criminal history, which included theft and vandalism, though nothing too serious had happened so far. David was divorced and unemployed, but had been involved in multiple thefts, including one from a prominent businessman. Paul described David as sociable, but somewhat incoherent, not making a particularly threatening impression. According to Paul, David had been hired by a plastic surgeon to carry out the murder, but he didn't know the doctor's name. A friend of David's, who contacted the police, reported that David had been in a depressive state in recent days, constantly drunk and under the influence of illegal substances. He behaved irrationally and seemed ready to take his own life. In this condition, the killer began telling Paul what had happened, and Paul decided to inform the police. When investigators came to speak with the new suspect, David became visibly nervous. He gave confused answers to their questions and appeared highly suspicious. When confronted with what the police knew, he gradually confessed that he had been hired by the plastic surgeon Thomas Dixon to commit the murder. David then laid out in detail the sequence of events from that fateful day. David said that he had met the plastic surgeon in a bar, and it turned out they had a lot in common, as both were going through difficult breakups with their partners at the time. Over a few drinks, they struck up a friendship, bonding over their shared experiences and trying to find comfort in each other. Thomas opened up about his sad love story, recounting how Rachel had left him and was now with another man. He explained that this breakup had deeply affected him, as he was madly in love with her and couldn't forget her. Dr. Dixon had made numerous changes in his life to be with Rachel, even planning to marry her, but she had left him regardless. Thomas was determined to get Rachel back, and he believed that to do so, he needed to eliminate the one obstacle standing in his way, Dr. Sonnier. He believed that once Joseph was out of the picture, Rachel would come back to him. David sympathized with his new friend and agreed to help him in his mission. Together, they devised a plan, though initially it wasn't supposed to involve murder. Their plan was to defame Joseph by tarnishing his reputation, making Rachel leave him. The first part of the plan involved exaggerating the harassment claims from Joseph's ex-girlfriends and making it seem like Joseph was a terrible person. They even wrote a letter from a supposed ex-lover accusing Joseph of abandoning her, but Rachel didn't believe it. When this plan failed, it became clear that the two conspirators were prepared to go further to achieve their goal. They turned to Plan B, murder. Thomas Dixon decided that the only way to win Rachel back was to kill Joseph Sonnier, as ruining his reputation hadn't worked. Dixon was convinced that after Joseph's death, Rachel would come crawling back to him. To execute this plan, Thomas needed David's help. As payment, Dixon offered David 3 silver bars, valued at around $5,000 in total. David agreed, and Thomas immediately gave him one of the bars as a down payment. David then took it to a pawn shop and cashed it in. He told the police how they prepared for the crime, with Dr. Dixon providing him with a gun. David's task was to follow Joseph, learn his daily routine, and figure out the best time to strike. He kept a close eye on the victim, and the plastic surgeon remained in constant contact with him, monitoring Joseph's whereabouts in real time. On the appointed day, David arrived at Joseph's home before he returned, positioning himself on a chair in the backyard. He was wearing a cap, safety goggles, and carried a bag. He waited patiently for Joseph to come home, armed with a gun that had a wine bottle attached to the barrel as a makeshift silencer, along with gloves and a knife. The gun was meant to be the primary weapon, but the knife was kept as a backup in case the gun failed. David also had a belt, which he planned to use to strangle the victim if both the gun and the knife didn't work. Throughout the crime, and in the lead-up, Dixon and David exchanged messages. This correspondence was later uncovered and became one of the key pieces of evidence during the trial. The crime, however, did not go according to plan from the very beginning. When Joseph arrived home late that night, he noticed an intruder on his back porch. He approached and knocked on the window from the inside, trying to get David's attention and scare him off. The would-be victim politely asked David what he was doing on his private property. In response, the intruder pulled out a gun and fired several shots at Joseph through the now shattered window. After that, David reached inside the broken window and fired more shots, but even then, Joseph wasn't killed. Joseph tried to flee down the hallway, and David, fearing that Joseph might have a weapon to defend himself, immediately followed him. He caught up with Joseph in the garage and began stabbing him repeatedly. After a few stabs, the pathologist fell to the ground, showing no signs of life. David then inflicted 3 or 4 more stabs to vital organs to ensure Joseph was dead. David rushed back to the car and reported everything in detail to his employer. When he returned, he immediately received the remaining 2 silver bars, along with a box of Cuban cigars, as a thank you for his work. Dr. Dixon listened intently to the report, treated and bandaged David's wounds from the struggle, and advised him to lay low for a while. Evidence supporting David's confession was abundant. For example, a photo accidentally left on his phone showed him posing in front of a mirror inside Joseph's house. Additionally, DNA samples collected at the crime scene matched David's, and location data from his phone confirmed that he was at the victim's house at the time of the murder. Dr. Thomas Dixon was arrested on charges of first-degree murder based on David's confession and a large amount of supporting evidence, including incriminating phone calls and text messages exchanged between the conspirators. When the police first questioned Dixon, they hoped to get a confession from the mastermind behind the murder. However, Dixon was visibly shaken and clumsily claimed that he didn't even understand which Dr. Sonnier they were talking about. When the police pressed him with the evidence, Dixon quickly requested a lawyer. The case went to trial, with David Shepard agreeing to cooperate with the prosecution as part of a plea deal. He immediately pled guilty to being the hired killer. As part of the deal, he waived his right to appeal the verdict, and in return, he was spared the death penalty. Instead, he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Thomas Dixon, on the other hand, was much harder to crack. He continued to maintain his innocence during the trial. The prosecution charged him with capital murder, but chose not to seek the death penalty, likely because they believed the jury wouldn't unanimously agree on such a harsh sentence. Although there was significant evidence against Dixon, most of it was circumstantial. His defense team worked hard to paint a flawless picture of him as a well-respected professional with an impeccable reputation, both at work and in his personal life. The defense lawyers challenged David's testimony and even questioned the authenticity and relevance of the messages exchanged between Dixon and David. Despite the prosecution's best efforts, the jury ultimately found Dixon not guilty in his first trial. Much of the confusion stemmed from David, who, while testifying under a plea deal, appeared to favor Dixon, claiming that he had planned and executed the murder all by himself. 2 jurors from the first trial expressed reasonable doubt, leading to a mistrial. But the Sonnier family didn't give up. The case was reopened, and in 2016, a new trial took place. This time, after reviewing all the case materials, the jury deliberated for about 3 hours before coming to the conclusion that Dixon was indeed guilty of first-degree murder. Since the prosecution had not sought the death penalty, Dixon was automatically sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. One of the key pieces of evidence leading to his conviction was provided by his own daughter, who presented damning information during the trial. Additionally, Paul Reynolds, who initially called the police, testified about how David had confessed to him that Dixon had hired him for the murder. Dixon's daughter also revealed that her father had tried to cover for his accomplice. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Dr. Dixon continued to claim his innocence, insisting that he had nothing to do with the death of his romantic rival, Dr. Joseph Sonnier. Dixon was not satisfied with the court's decision, and his lawyers filed an appeal, which eventually led to the overturning of his conviction. Dixon was released on a $2 million bail, but the fight for justice wasn't over yet. In 2019, the state prosecutor's office filed a petition with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals asking for the reinstatement of the previous verdict. If the appeal was unsuccessful, a third trial was likely to take place. The prosecutor's request was filed on February 11, 2019, and the next phase of the legal process occurred in April 2020. During this time, Dixon's bail was revoked and a new arrest warrant was issued against him. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the earlier ruling, reinstating Dixon's conviction. The judge concluded that Dixon should continue serving his life sentence without parole. Dixon is currently behind bars in a Lubbock, Texas, correctional facility. Throughout all the legal turmoil and media attention, Rachel, the woman who became the central figure in the conflict between the two men, sought to lead a quiet, peaceful life, staying out of the public eye. Although she remained in the same town, she kept herself shielded from journalists and the public. In 2016, she even filed a lawsuit against a magazine that had published an article describing her involvement in a love triangle with both the victim and the murderer. The article portrayed her as a gold-digging woman who destroyed marriages, which she vehemently denied. Rachel sought $2 million in moral damages, but her claim was rejected. Despite her reluctance to make her life public, Rachel spoke to the media on a few occasions. She expressed feelings of guilt for having unwittingly brought a criminal into the life of a truly loving and honest man. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel and like. See you in the next video. Investigations into crimes do not always go smoothly. Every criminal wants to stay free and continue to do evil. Some cases of blatant cruelty are investigated for years. This was also the case with a young girl who was burned alive. Jessica Chambers was born on February 2nd in Clarksdale, Mississippi, USA. Her parents separated when Jessica was only 3 years old. Later, her father remarried a woman with children, so the girl had 7 half-siblings. However, despite having many close relatives, the child had a rather difficult childhood. Her father was involved in the production of illegal substances for a long time until he was arrested and sent to prison. The girl grew up in a rough and borderline environment. Her father served his sentence, but unlike most criminals, he managed to break out of the vicious circle of crime. After his release, he found a job as a mechanic at a local auto repair shop. Jessica grew up in the small town of Cortland, Mississippi. You could say it wasn't even a town, but more of a village, because at the time of the events, fewer than 500 people lived there. Unlike other similar settlements, it became a refuge for people with a dark past. The average crime rate there was over 50% above the national average. Historically, most of the residents were, in one way or another, connected to crime. The young Jessica didn't care about that. She grew up peacefully and attended high school. Here, the girl performed as a cheerleader and was considered an outstanding student due to her unique abilities. At the end of her studies, she had a high grade point average. However, there were constant problems at home. The girl lived with her mother for a long time, who was in a bad mood. When she started dating a man who lived in the house across the street, her parents took this event very negatively. The woman tried to control her daughter and disapproved of her choice of partner. Due to the constant arguments, the girl was forced to move out of her mother's house. Fortunately, she didn't have to move far, as her father and his new wife lived just a few streets away. The stepmother's name was Deb, which even improved her relationship with her mother, as Jessica regularly spent nights at her mother's house. But life as a teenager was quite stressful, and then in 2012, her brother died in a car accident. The girl was very close to him, and the tragic accident was a real blow from which she couldn't recover for a long time. Nevertheless, Jessica finished school and took a job in a supermarket to support herself. She worked as a clothing salesperson. Alongside this beautiful side of her life, there was also Jessica's dark side. Sometimes she smoked illegal substances. This was one of the reasons for her arrest, but none of this worsened people's opinion of her. Jessica continued to be a kind and friendly person. Given the track record of most of the town's residents, her arrest for drug use was a minor thing that went unnoticed. However, this set off a chain of events that possibly led the girl to a tragic end. The 19-year-old Jessica was dating Travis Stanford, who was in prison at the time. The man was 28 years old, and the girl's criminal record didn't bother him. She awaited the release of her boyfriend from prison. She had grown up in an environment very closely connected to crime, not to mention the notorious reputation of the town in general. Even her own father had spent time in prison, but then led a normal life, so Jessica didn't pay attention to minor issues like prison stays. On December 6, 2014, around 4 p.m., Jessica visited her mother, Lisa. She planned to go to the gas station and return right after, but the girl was gone for a long time. The trip should have taken about 10 to 15 minutes, but even after 2 hours, she hadn't returned. Her mother got worried and texted Jessica to find out when she would be home. The girl did not respond, so Lisa called her daughter's cell phone, but she didn't pick up. Worry grew, and the woman called again. This time, her daughter answered the phone and whispered that she would be back soon and that everything was fine. This was highly unusual. Her mother was used to Jessica listening to loud music and always having noise in the background, but this time it was too quiet. This worried the girl's mother, but she calmed down since she could reach her daughter on the phone, and they had talked. After a short conversation, they said goodbye, and just a few hours later, the girl's parents faced something they hadn't expected. Around 8 p.m., 2 residents called 911. They found a burning Kia Rio in a neighborhood in Batesville. Just 2 minutes later, firefighters arrived at the scene and were the only ones trying to fight the fire. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared from a nearby forest. The firefighters turned one of the vehicles around and shone the headlights on the person approaching them. They were shocked to see a girl, completely burned and disfigured by the fire. She was so severely damaged that she was unrecognizable. The victim barely moved toward the rescuers, stretched out her arms, and pleaded for help before collapsing just 2 meters away from the firefighters. She waited there for the ambulance, unable to get up. At this point, the car was almost completely burned out. Most of the fire was in the engine and passenger compartments, while the trunk was only slightly affected. While part of the fire crew continued to extinguish the fire, one of them began helping the victim. He wrapped her in a blanket, as burns often make victims feel cold. The police arrived at the scene and spoke to the 2 boys who had discovered the burning car. They were alarmed by the victim's condition and immediately suspected that this was no accident. The girl looked terrifying, completely burned and wearing only her underwear. One of the police officers supported her, reassured her, and asked her a few questions. Most of the victim's body was covered in third-degree burns, and her hair and eyebrows were completely burned off. She could barely speak. The officer first tried to find out her name, but she could hardly pronounce the syllables. He had to lean his ear close to her mouth to hear. At first, he didn't understand her name, but then he looked closer and recognized Jessica Chambers by her eyes. He asked who had done this to her. The victim struggled to say coherent words, and the officer heard something that sounded like Eric. She then lost consciousness. At that moment, paramedics arrived at the scene. They tried to revive the victim by applying pressure to her chest with their fingers, and it worked. A resident recognized that the burning car belonged to the victim, as everyone in the small town knew each other. After first aid, Jessica regained consciousness, but only briefly. The girl tried to figure out who had been in the car with her before the tragedy. A crowd of onlookers had gathered around, drawn by the burning car. These people hindered the questioning by making noise and whispering, making it difficult for the officer to hear the faint sounds that the burned Jessica could still make. Despite everything, he managed to make out the name Eric, although he wasn't 100% sure. He asked someone to bring him a piece of paper and a pen so the girl could confirm the name in writing. But unfortunately, her burns were so severe that her hands couldn't hold anything. She could no longer move, let alone write a note. After repeatedly verifying his suspicions, the officer tried to confirm whether the name was Derek or Eric or another consonant, but nothing more could be determined. The paramedics loaded the victim into the vehicle and transported her to the hospital for treatment. On the way there, they continued to talk to her, asking her name to confirm her identity, and the paramedic repeated the officer's suspicion. When asked if her name was Jessica Chambers, she nodded affirmatively. The victim then tried once more to name her attacker. The paramedics asked if the name was Eric or Derek, but she denied both names. She was taken to Regional Hospital No. 1 in Memphis, Tennessee, where doctors fought to keep her alive. Police officers then informed the girl's parents about the tragic news of the fire and the serious condition of their daughter. They were an hour away from the hospital where Jessica had been taken. Her father picked up her mother, Lisa, and they drove together to support their daughter and find out what had happened. The drive felt like an eternity because of their worries. They arrived between 2 and 3 a.m. at the hospital. When they entered the room where the girl lay, the mother immediately recognized that it was her daughter, even though the victim was burned beyond recognition. She could not see or breathe properly. The woman bent over the crib and whispered into her daughter's ear that everything would be okay and that she and her father were nearby. A few minutes later, Jessica Chambers succumbed to her injuries. The only part of her body that wasn't burned was a small section of her neck. Given the extent of her injuries, she had no chance of survival. The medical examiners estimated that at least 93% of her body was burned, with all second and third degree burns. Almost the entire town attended Jessica Chambers' funeral. Over 400 people gathered in the chapel to say goodbye to the 19-year-old girl. Among them were classmates who had written heartfelt messages on her white metal coffin with permanent markers. They were all left with the same question: who could have done such a thing to the young cheerleader? Some thought it was an accident related to a possible car crash, but the police immediately ruled that out, as there were no traces of another car on the sidewalk or the adjacent roadside. Moreover, while the car was burned out, there were no visible signs of a collision. The police considered attempted murder the most likely scenario, especially since Jessica had tried to speak the name of her attacker until her last moments. In any case, the police made the incident public in the media. A reward of $1,000 was offered for any tips leading to the arrest of the perpetrator. Meanwhile, investigators sought out Lisa, the victim's mother. With her help, they tried to piece together the last day of the girl's life. Investigators also tried to find out whom she had spoken to and whether there were potentially dangerous people in her social circle. According to the woman, Jessica returned home around 2 p.m. and then lay down on the living room couch. After a brief conversation, the girl told her mother she needed to go to a gas station near the house. There were no landmarks in the area. the only place Jessica could have headed to was the local grocery store. Investigators decided to talk to the clerk who was on duty that fateful day. Maybe he had noticed something suspicious and could provide useful information to the police. When the investigators arrived at the store, they met Ali, who told them that he had indeed seen a girl matching the description of the murdered Jessica. The clerk cooperated with the investigation, granting access to the security cameras, and the police found the necessary footage. The footage showed that Jessica approached the store's door around 6:25 p.m., but didn't have time to go inside because someone called her name. She stopped in front of the door, turned to the side, and waved. Unfortunately, her acquaintance wasn't in the frame. After waving, she walked in that direction, out of the store and out of the camera's view. Several minutes passed without the girl reappearing in the frame. It's unknown what happened during that time, but then she returned to the door, paid for the gas, and left. The officers didn't find anything suspicious in the clerk's behavior. However, the public thought otherwise. When it became known that the last person who had definitely seen the victim alive was Ali, many thought he was the killer. Some believed he was the murderer of Jessica. Witnesses emerged, claiming he was a member of a local criminal gang. Thus, the man who had provided the investigators with the first clues came under fire from the local population. The police ensured that he wasn't involved in the massacre of the girl. He had a solid alibi. The surveillance footage showed that the man had spent the entire evening and night at work, and he had also passed a lie detector test. The investigators then made an official statement on television. The local sheriff reported that the grocery store employee had nothing to do with the victim's death. Gradually, the unrest subsided, and the employee was left alone by the public. At this point, the police already knew some details of the crime. For instance, medical examiners discovered that the girl had been doused with a chemical substance, probably an accelerant or gasoline, and then set on fire. This was the reason for her injuries, as ignited liquid is very difficult to extinguish. She burned, and there was nothing she could do about it. It's hard to imagine the pain Jessica must have suffered before she died in the hospital. Parts of her burned underwear were later found at the crime scene, sent for analysis, and it was confirmed that the flammable substance used to kill the innocent victim was gasoline. Investigators questioned one man after another, checking all residents named Derek or Eric. They also scrutinized her boyfriend, Travis, but he was in jail at the time of the attack and was ruled out as a suspect. Public opinion played a very negative role in this investigation. After the public had accused Ali, who was later exonerated, attention turned to Jessica's father. Many believed that his criminal record was enough to accuse the man of murdering his own daughter. Some witnesses recalled that Ben had expressed racist views, even though his daughter had a romantic relationship with someone of a different race. This was seen as a likely motive to retaliate against his daughter's disobedience. To clear himself of suspicion and avoid confusing the investigation, Ben was forced to take a lie detector test and provide an alibi. He then publicly stated that he had no prejudice against people of other races. Despite his criminal record, he was a loving father and would never harm his child. During this time, investigators spoke with the victim's best friend, who was named Kesha. According to her, they were together in town on the day of Jessica's death and then drove off together in a car. Before noon, they met a 27-year-old man named Quinton. They chatted, smoked illegal substances, and then drove straight to the store where the victim was last seen alive. Quinton had a less than desirable reputation and a criminal record involving burglaries and assaults on others. He had met Jessica just 2 weeks before her burning, so they barely knew each other. After receiving information about the new suspect, investigators immediately reached out to him for an interview. During this interview, Quinton was very open and willingly answered the police's questions. He said he didn't know the victim of the crime very well, as they hadn't talked much and were merely acquaintances. Quinton claimed he had met the girl by chance. She and her friend had given him a ride to the store. Naturally, he denied any involvement in the subsequent tragic events. His words seemed plausible enough, and Quinton remained calm during the interrogation. The investigators asked him if he knew anyone named Derek or Eric from the victim's inner circle, similar to the names Jessica had mentioned before her death. Then Quinton remembered a man named Derek Holmes who had behaved strangely toward Jessica. According to Quinton, Derek had repeatedly asked her out on a date, which she declined. This also happened on the day of the massacre. When Quinton got out of the car, Derek again tried to woo her. The police were interested in the information they received. They sought out Derek, but despite some oddities, Derek didn't arouse much suspicion. The man had an alibi. On the night of the attack on Jessica, he was at home massaging his mother's feet. It sounded strange, but the woman had diabetes, and the massage helped her cope with the effects of the disease. She confirmed credibly that her son was at home. Most importantly, Derek denied Quinton's claim that he had met Jessica on the day of her death and had never behaved dismissively toward her. This was also confirmed by others in her social circle. Her best friend also insisted that Quinton was the only one in the car. This was the first time Quinton had been caught lying. He began to lose the investigators' trust. Nevertheless, the investigators had to start over and tried to gather information about the perpetrator. They interviewed about 100 men, potential suspects with the names Eric or Derek, but the investigation stalled. At the same time, public outrage grew because most of these men were black. Rumors spread that the police were deliberately trying to discriminate against local residents based on their race. The last people to be interviewed in this case were George and Mentor. Their fingerprints were taken, and even DNA swabs were collected. Mentor was of particular interest to the investigation because he had communicated with Jessica just 2 days before her death via a messenger app. Both were contacted by the police, but again, they came up empty-handed. The men had solid alibis confirmed by several people, and they claimed they weren't involved in the massacre of the young girl. They really knew each other and had been friends for many years. Despite the police's active efforts, the investigation stalled for 2 months. Investigators and the media received new clues when Jessica's cell phone was found. Not far from the crime scene, a man stumbled upon the phone while walking around the neighborhood. He turned it over to the police, and specialists were able to retrieve the last messages and calls. It turned out that the victim had sent a text message to an unknown number on the day of the attack. The man had apparently wanted to win over the girl and move the relationship to an intimate level, but she kept her distance, making it clear that she wasn't interested in his advances. This persistent admirer turned out to be the same Quinton, who had not mentioned to the police anything about harassing the victim and claimed they didn't know each other well. Investigators invited him for another interview, and under the pressure of evidence, the young man admitted to having an intimate relationship with the murdered girl. He claimed they had sex in her car several times, but no one believed him, as she had rejected his advances in their chats. Quinton, however, maintained to investigators that he hadn't been intimate with her on the night of the murder and was not at the crime scene. When the investigators searched his house, they found gasoline in his shed, though this wasn't unusual since many car owners kept gasoline as a backup. When asked to take a look at his cell phone, the young man said he had deleted all of Jessica's messages as soon as he heard about her death. Despite the investigators' surprise, Quinton casually stated that he simply didn't want to keep unnecessary information in the messenger since the girl had died and they couldn't have a relationship anymore. Suddenly, Quinton revealed that he had an alibi for the time of the girl's death because he was at a store called Fress, buying a prepaid card for his girlfriend, who lived in Louisiana. According to him, the card was meant to help his girlfriend travel to him. The police went to the store to verify his alibi, and it turned out he had indeed been there around midnight. However, Quinton was only 15 minutes away from the crime scene, so he had a real opportunity to reach the store in time to cover his tracks. Unfortunately, the investigators couldn't confirm their suspicions as they had no solid evidence at the time. Meanwhile, they decided to take a closer look at Travis, the girl's boyfriend, who was in prison at the time of her death. It was possible that he had learned of her possible affair with Quinton and therefore had the girl massacred with the help of mercenaries from local gangster groups. However, Travis was once again ruled out as a suspect, as he could not have been involved in his girlfriend's death. He was deeply affected by the news of her tragic death and knew nothing of her dubious relationship with Quinton. The case stalled again, and for 6 months, there was no new information. When police analysts reviewed the records of calls and conversations from Quinton's phone and the victims, they were able to establish that the two were indeed a couple. They determined that they were in Batesville at the same time, near the spot where the victim's car had been burned. They spoke with Quinton again, and he confirmed that he had been in Batesville. At the same time, Quinton insisted that he had arrived there much later, after the attack on Jessica, and had nothing to do with her death. His story changed several times during the interrogation. According to one version, Quinton and his friend met the girl on the street, after which he sold her illegal substances, and they parted ways. The suspect claimed he had been with a friend named Big Mike at the time. No one believed his words, as everything Quinton said contradicted the friend's testimony. When the investigators confronted him with this and asked further questions, he wouldn't confirm that he had met up with his friend that day. It turned out that the main suspect had lied to the police again, as they had suspected. When confronted about this, Quinton once again changed his story, saying that he had indeed been with Jessica and her friend in the car. They had hung out until around 7 p.m. The friend reported that they had chatted, smoked, and then gone their separate ways. He claimed he had nothing to do with her death. Despite his words, Quinton seemed shocked and very worried about the direction of the investigation. All this only increased the suspicion against him. 14 months had passed since Jessica's death. On February 24, 2016, the investigators handling Jessica's case held a press conference. They announced that they finally had a prime suspect, Quinton. The investigators said they had evidence of this man's involvement in the brutal massacre, but the public was already distrustful. People couldn't shake the feeling that the investigation was being conducted under heavily racist conditions. The arrest of the dark-skinned Quinton only fueled these rumors, which persisted until the trial of the possible brutal murderer. The prosecution was the first to comment on the trial, which began on October 10, 2017. The hearing was held in Batesville. The prosecutor pointed to Quinton as the last person to have seen Jessica alive. The couple had a questionable relationship. The girl had rejected him, and Quinton had hit on her. It was confirmed that her boyfriend had been near the crime scene at the time of the arson. According to the prosecution, Quinton attacked Jessica and strangled her until she was unconscious. Believing her to be dead, he decided to dispose of the body and the evidence by setting it on fire. To do this, he went home and got a can of gasoline from his shed. When he returned to the crime scene, he doused the victim and her car with gasoline and set it on fire. The girl suddenly woke up and managed to escape the burning car. However, the burns she sustained left her no chance of survival. The defense relied on the victim's own words, as Jessica had said a name that sounded like Eric or Derek. Quinton's name did not resemble that name at all. These were the last words of the dying girl. Moreover, the The prepaid card for the girl from Louisiana had been purchased around 8 p.m., as confirmed by receipts, just minutes after the report of a burning car had been made. In that short time, the defense argued, the attacker certainly wouldn't have had time to travel the distance to the store. The prosecution then presented a map based on the recorded locations of the victims and Quinton's cell phones. As it turned out, they almost exactly matched. However, there was a known period between 8:49 p.m. and 9:26 p.m. when no phone activity occurred. The prosecution managed to pinpoint the moment when the perpetrator had gone to get gasoline. According to the prosecution, this happened around 7:50 p.m., and after a brief pause, Quinton's phone returned to the crime scene. At the same time, the girl and the man didn't exchange any messages or calls, which was suspicious. The lawyer, however, argued that there weren't enough communication towers in this town to track the location of mobile devices with high accuracy. They could be displaying false information. An independent expert was found who confirmed this. Moreover, none of the camera footage showed Quinton driving the car, and even the license plates were blurry. Furthermore, there was a text message sent from the victim's phone at 7:43 p.m., in which Quinton wished her good night and said he looked forward to seeing her tomorrow. The prosecution dismissed these claims, arguing that the messages had been sent specifically to create an alibi. By this point, the victim's best friend had already denied any relationship between Jessica and Quinton. According to her, Jessica had never liked him. After all the arguments were presented, the defense attorney made one last move that was uncomfortable for the prosecution. She drew the jury's attention to the possibility of discrimination, arguing that the investigation had largely targeted black men, treating them as suspects. The prosecution, however, denied this. According to the prosecutors, they had evidence that Quinton had repeatedly tried to become intimate with Jessica, but she had always turned him down. Numerous conversations were presented in which she had responded to his advances with restraint. Nonetheless, the defendant continued to claim that their relationship had been consensual. He even demonstrated the place and position in which they had had sex in the girl's car, but that, of course, proved nothing. The prosecution still believed he was lying, and it was in this spot that the massacre of the victim took place. Her rejection of the relationship had become the motive for the murder. After the jury deliberated on the verdict, they were unable to reach a unanimous decision. The jury was then given additional time, but even after half an hour, they could not convict or acquit Quinton. When the jury made a third attempt, they failed again, and the court was forced to dismiss the trial. On September 24, 2018, a retrial began. It was similar in many ways to the previous one, with the difference being that the prosecution called in a burn expert to examine the victim's body. The expert confirmed that the victim, due to the extent of her injuries, was unable to fully speak, meaning she could not name the perpetrator that night, and a false name had been heard. Additionally, autopsy results were presented, showing signs of blows to the girl's body. According to the prosecution, these were also signs of a struggle. In this trial, the prosecution felt more confident and was determined to convict Quinton. However, once again, the jury failed to reach a unanimous decision. Meanwhile, Quinton quietly built his life. He got married on August 8, 2015, and lived a carefree life. On the same day as his wedding, the body of a 34-year-old student named Mink Chin Yao was discovered in Monroe, Louisiana, with stab wounds in her own home. About 10 days after her death, when the body began to emit a characteristic odor, forensic experts found 30 deep wounds, clearly inflicted with great cruelty. During the investigation, checks were found, and bank transfers confirmed that the girl had cashed in some money and purchased a prescription for painkillers from a man. With this fake document, she bought the corresponding medications. Mink Chin Yao drove to the store with a dark-skinned man at the wheel. When checking the license plate, It turned out that the car belonged to Quinton. These videos were recorded just a few hours before Mindy, as her friends called her, was killed. After her death, more than $1,000 was withdrawn from her card, and camera footage showed that it was Quinton who went to the ATM. Everything pointed to his involvement in her murder. Quinton was charged with the murder of Mindy and the theft of money from her card. In this trial, the prosecution could not present enough evidence against Quinton, and he was only found guilty of stealing the money from the deceased. For this, he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison. In November 2022, another trial in the Jessica Chambers case ended. The court found Quinton not guilty. The prosecutors were unable to convince the jury of his involvement in the brutal massacre of the cheerleader due to insufficient evidence. The families of both victims have yet to receive justice. The families of the murdered girls do not believe that Quinton coincidentally showed up at the crime scene both times. They are convinced that Quinton is behind the murders and are disappointed that they cannot bring him to justice. Jessica's mother died in October 2023 in the hospital. The cause of death was never determined, but it is likely that she simply could not cope with the loss and the poor handling of the case by the police. There are still dozens of unanswered questions about the deaths of the two young girls. Thank you for watching, and take care.